one of the side effects of thinking about consciousness is a sort of inflation that sets in. And when people think about consciousness, they get themselves baffled, and then they explain their bafflement by postulating properties and things that just don't exist. They're kidding themselves. They're sort of duping themselves into believing in more than is actually there. So it's always good at the outset to alert people to this problem by showing them that for instance, their vision is not as detailed as they think it is. In fact, if it weren't for the fact that our eyes dart around continuously, little jumps called saccades, we'd have a sort of tunnel vision for the world, which would be very limited. It seems right now as if I can take in all this detail around me, the snow and the trees outside and the furniture and all, every detail of your face and everything else. But in fact, I'm only really taking in the detail from an area that's about the size of my thumbnail at arm's length. That's what isn't there is actually not being registered by my brain in full detail. It seems to be, but it isn't. Now, that's just incontrovertible. We know that's the case. Physiology and neuroscience, neuroanatomy establishes that. So we already have a pretty powerful illusion. The illusion of the plenum, the fullness of our experience, that's a trick that our brain is playing on us. Magicians know a lot about this because they know how easy it is to misdirect people's attention and do things right in front of their eyes that they never see because their perceptual consciousness is not as rich as they think it is. The reason people think it's so rich is because whatever they get curious about, they get immediate satisfaction. It's wherever they shine the spotlight of attention, which is not a good metaphor, but it's very tempting. That area is illuminated. That area, there's plenty of detail there. And they think the detail's there when they're not attending. It's not. And hosts of experiments show that. So, on the one hand, armchair introspection, speculation, armchair theorizing is almost bound to give you a very distorted sense of what the phenomena are. And then you try to make a theory from those phenomena, and you start off with an inflated catalog. So that's the first thing that we have to do is show people with experiments on themselves how easy it is for them to be wrong about what's actually in their consciousness.
In the same way that we're not conscious of the whole visual field the way we think we are, is there a sense in which, not even metaphorically, but we're not conscious of our whole life the way we think we are?
Oh, I think that's true. The late Gerald Edelman once said one thing that's remarkable about consciousness is its continuity. I said, no, what's remarkable about it is its discontinuity. How oblivious we are of our own oblivion about so much. We don't know what we don't know.
So any person's biography contains hundreds of empty pages.
Our own brains are not at all transparent to us. What's transparent to us is only we discover that we know what we're thinking about. We know what we're experiencing. That is, we can tell a story about what we're thinking about. That's a very important fact. And by the way, we're the only species that can do that. A dog can't tell a story about what it's thinking about. It can't. It doesn't have language.
A Qualia defender would concede that there's no way to even introspectively know what's happening under the hood, how the brain does that. Yeah. He would just claim that there's an inner experience to which he has a privileged access. Yeah. And when Chalmers says first-person data, that in itself is problematic. How would you proceed to describe what you're experiencing?
See, I think my first challenge to Chalmers is the first-person data are the convictions we have about our first-person experience. Those are good data. And I want to explain those beliefs. I take it on board. One of the things that a theory of consciousness has to explain is all the beliefs that we have about our first-person experience. Now, some people, some thinkers have said, well, that's not enough. You got to, not just the beliefs, but what the beliefs are about. Those are the data. No, they're not. They just aren't. The data are your beliefs about what's happening in your head. You might be wrong.
So if you're wrong about your beliefs, or even about what you perceive, and there would be a truth about what's happening in your experience that would not be revealed by your beliefs and not even be detectable in any way if we have only your beliefs as a source of information about what's going on in you.
It's an interesting wedge that you're trying to draw between a person's beliefs, convictions, judgments about their experience and their experience. It is possible to be in a situation where if I'm asked, which of these two things did I experience, I don't know. Or I may say one thing, but there is evidence that I've misreported my own experience. That evidence is third-person evidence about how I behave. Behavioral signs of various sorts, including internal behavior, upset in my nervous system or the hormonal response of my body or whatever, belies what I insist on. Then something's got to give. And I think what's obvious that what has to give is any idea that we have privileged access to what it's like to be us. We have privileged access to what we think it's like to be us, but that itself can be wrong. As soon as we move away from belief and what we think is the case to what is the case, we're moving away from privileged access. I have maintained for years that this is all a sequela of the fact that we have language, and so we have the problem of articulating what it's like to be us. In fact, the reason we're so sure it's like something to be you and me is so we can talk about it. We can reflect endlessly on the status of the things that occur to us. We've been raised to talk to people about what it's like to be us and what we think. And that's a very special talent we have.
what is there instead of qualia?
Let's talk gingerly about the term representation. There are lots of public representations. There's paintings, blue period Picasso paintings of things that are blue. And there's lots of public representations of blue things that involve, blue pigment. And these are all public physical properties of representations in the world. But there's also representations of blue things in our heads. These are not public representations, and they do not involve anything like pigment. They don't have to. Pigment is great for bouncing photons off into eyes that have rods and cones in particular. But once you're beyond that, there's no role for a property like the property of pigment to play. But that doesn't mean that there aren't states of the brain that represent to the person or agent whose brain it is something being blue, for real or not. So what are the properties of those representations? Well, who knows at this point? They're nervous system states that are identifiable by their conditions of occurrence. When do they happen and why? We have to be a functionalist about this. See that blue door? There's something in your brain which says the door is blue.
This is the difference between having a phenomenal quality of blue instantiated in my brain and having the quality of blue represented by my brain.
Yeah.
So, of course...
The latter exists and the former doesn't.
Doesn't. So I'm looking at a blue door. Obviously, there's nothing blue in my brain. Yeah. There's nothing in the shape of a door in my brain. I'm detecting a door. There's no second transduction. So neurochemical signals all the way down. And that door is represented in some area of vision as the door. But I'm perceiving that door. And if you play around with that area of vision, I won't perceive it the same way. I could lose my sight altogether. The question is pretty basic. How do you get from those spike trains to the door that I see outside?
We have to ask what I call the hard question, and then what happens? What is your brain enabled to do thanks to its being in the state it's in? Well, there's 1,000 things your brain is enabled to do when it goes into that state. It's enabled to remember other blue doors and compare the blue of this door to the blue that it remembers those other doors to be. It could talk about the blue door. It could try to buy the blue door.
But it's also allowing me to see that blue door right there in front of me.
Well, sure. And it allows you to see it because your eyes are open and you have lots of spatial information about where the door is, how far away it is from your body. You can't reach out and touch it. You know that.
But all that, this experience that I'm having of seeing the door,
yeah,
it's something that's cooked up in my brain. I mean, it is represented by spike trains. Yet what I'm experiencing is not in the form of spike trains. It's in the form of the phenomenal properties of my experience.
It's in the form of the properties of the things in the world that you're experiencing. In terms of the properties of the door. Its actual shape, its color, The only properties we need are the properties that sentient creatures are enabled to detect and discriminate and remember and use to guide their behavior.
Yeah, I get all that. And once the photons hit my retina, and once I get all the information, of course, a lot of processing can occur, and a lot of discrimination, a lot of disposition to action, a lot of downstream effects. That's not problematic. But I'm still experiencing the perception of this door. And that is a fact of my brain who is having this experience. Of course, the door is outside. It's not in my brain because there's nothing like that in my brain. But it's still, there's something happening in that representation that creates a link between this outside object and my experience of it.
Everything that you've just said, you are enabled to say and motivated to say by machinery in your brain.
Yeah.
And that's what makes you a conscious, articulate human being. And what we have to confront is that in the end, there is going to be a scientific story of you, where you, the conscious self, is not a character in the story. There's just a living body, a living brain, and all of that. And the first person story is extractable from that third person account, but it doesn't exist in any other sense. That's illusionism.
So is that the path out of this problem, is to say that just as the so-called qualia that I'm experiencing, the subject, the I that's in there or wherever, itself is an illusion. It's created by the whole system.
Absolutely.
And also with that, even the opposition of the subject and object dissolves if the I is made to be another participant in the whole show. And if you do that, maybe then it's the difficulty of bridging the gap between the spike trains and the outside world also dissolves.
Well, yes. A theory of consciousness has to include and explain at a microphysical level all of the abilities of the subject. And if you stop short of that, which is almost the standard practice, people working on consciousness, no wonder you're baffled, because you're not tackling exactly half the problem. If you still have somebody home in your theory, you haven't got a theory of consciousness yet. It's got to be a theory of machinery cranking away where none of it depends on consciousness. Yes, of course, we start with the first person point of view when we're dealing with consciousness. And that's because we are thinking, talking theorists. And we've noticed that we are. And wow, I know things about me that you don't know, and you know things about you that I don't know, but we can communicate. And so we've got this phenomenon that we're both participating in, and it's not only real, it's one of the most important. How is it that this living, talking body can do that, and that living, talking body can understand. These are perfectly good scientific questions. But when we do it, we have to recognize that the only answer that will hold up in the long run is one which doesn't explain away the first person point of view, but explain the first person point of view in third personal terms. That's what it is to have a first person point of view. We don't explain away color when we get the electromagnetic theory of color. We explain what color is. Now, there's a temptation for people to say, oh my gosh, color isn't real. It's real, it just isn't what you thought it was. Same with consciousness.
My son asked me that. He said, so if you understand all this about consciousness, and won't you lose something about the experience itself? Aren't you afraid that it becomes disenchanted in some way? And my answer was to say, well, the mechanisms, natural and cultural, that are at the source of the richness of your consciousness are so powerful that you would really have to do a lot of destructive work to break down the. Yeah. Would you agree with that? I mean,
well, I think yes, I do agree with that. I think that the sources of enchantment, or of marvel, of wonder, are so copious. There's so much to be enchanted by that we can readily jettison a few myths and still have plenty to savor, plenty to love and enjoy and respect and admire and be thrilled by. But I do think that we should acknowledge that people who are worried about disenchantment from a theory of consciousness, they're not wrong to take that seriously, because it is the case that as you grow up, you find you can no longer occupy perspectives of innocence that you once had. You can appreciate them. You can see your own children being fascinated, charmed, baffled, amazed by things that don't fascinate or charm or amaze you anymore because you understand them. So you've lost the ability to be gobsmacked by some feature of the world that used to just knock your socks off. That's true. That's one of the prices you pay for getting more information.
In some cases, once you start digging, you become even more gobsmacked.
That's the other side of it. That is, I myself think the bargain is obvious, and it obviously favors more knowledge rather than less. Here's the fact that enchants me now. In my body, there are trillions and trillions of little motor proteins, and they're moving stuff around in cells. They're walking along on little microtubule highways, And where do they get their power from? They get a lot of their power from the chaotic bouncing around of water molecules inside the cell. They're sailing. They're exploiting the uncontrolled energy in the water molecules to push them forward. And they have ratchets in effect, so that they can control which way they go, harnessing the energy of the turbulence in their environment. What a brilliant idea. The idea that I've got trillions of little helmsmen in there steering their ships along, delivering their goods, and that I wouldn't be alive without it. That's
something you want. Something you want to know.
That's something I want to know. Yeah.
So you want to replace the question, the hard question, the hard problem by the hard question, which is, and then what happens?
Yeah.
So what happens after the material has entered consciousness or the brain, and what are the effects of that? In a sense, I suppose, our experience of the world, our qualia, are themselves already part of the answer. It's a beginning of the answer, since they contain dispositional properties, emotions. So this we're already downstream from.
Yes, but you have to let it. Let's take a loaded case. Let's take pain. Some people want to say pain as a quale is just intrinsically awful. And alarm bells go off in my head. What do you mean intrinsically awful? That is such a cop-out. Nobody knows what it could mean for something to be intrinsically awful. It's like saying gold is intrinsically valuable. We've gone off the gold standard. Turns out that was a useful crutch for a long time, but we now understand that money doesn't need any intrinsic economic value. Similarly, pain, the idea of something being intrinsically painful, that just creates a nugget of mystery. If pain is awful, and it is, it's because of what it does. It's what of the effects it has on you. If it didn't have those effects on you, it wouldn't be awful. Well, what effects does it have? It interrupts your train of thought. It prevents you from enjoying your meal. It prevents you from moving your limbs the way you want to. It intrudes on your thinking. It dominates your all your other senses. It overpowers your systems of attention. So all you end up doing is just lying in a helpless state. That's what pain. That's what's bad about pain. If you could eliminate all those, and then what happens affects the idea that pain, there'd still be the intrinsic awfulness of pain. No, there wouldn't.
It's very convincing when you break down pain like that. And we can see,
good.
we can, but I mean, I can easily see pain dissolve as long you take brick by brick, you take it down, and there's nothing else apart from the sum of those effects that you. But can you do the same thing with the perception of a blue sky?
Well, yes, you can. I'm glad you asked.
Okay. Let's hear it.
All right. So I look at the blue sky. Now, and then what happens? Well, it all depends on who I am and what I know. And maybe what happens is that the particular shade of blue and together with the breeze wafting over my face as I lie in the grass in the woods or something, looking up at the blue sky, it conjures up memories of other occasions when I've looked at the sky. Blue sky is good weather. It means it's not raining, it's not snowing. I have an inexhaustible fountain of associations, recollections, biases, which are all either triggered or triggerable by my looking at the sky. Now, we can start cutting those off piece by piece. And suppose that the blue sky can no longer be recognized by me as a sign of good weather. Suppose it no longer kindles recollections or memories. Suppose it has no effect on my bodily state, on my heart rate, on my respiration, on my galvanic skin response. We're going to subtract all of these things. At some point, it's not clear that I'm still conscious of the blue sky. My eyes are open. Joshua Rothman, in his lovely profile of me in the New Yorker, at the end of that, as a sort of personal coda, he says that he was very much a skeptic of my position until, this is very moving to me, he reflected on it while watching his mother, who was getting Alzheimer's and who was sort of slowly fading out of existence. And then, by subtraction, my theory began to make sense to him, because he began to see that the answer in her case to "and then what happens" was getting smaller and smaller. There was less happening in her as a result of seeing a blue sky, or hearing his voice, or holding his hand. The answer to "and then what happens" was diminishing, 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 diminishing. And what my theory of consciousness says, and you've already granted it in a way for pain, when you finish that job, there's no consciousness left. Consciousness is the sequelae.
Generally, the burden of a naturalist is, in a sense, greater than of an idealist or a dualist, because if you're a naturalist, you cannot leave loose ends. You can't plug a skyhook there or a soul over it. Everything has got to gel, has got to fit together. So you can't also leave the subject in your theory for the same reason.
I think I've recently compared the problem that faces the naturalist here as a much grander version of the problem that faces a naturalist trying to explain a magic trick. You see some gobsmacking magic trick, and you can't explain it. And you think, whoa, isn't that something? But you know what the rules are for explaining a magic trick, and you know there's no such thing as real magic. Necromancy and sorcerer's charms and the like. So the task is daunting, but for heaven's sake, don't give up, and don't just say, "Oh no, this has got to be sorcery." And it seems to me that the dualists and the idealists are basically, they're copping out and they're saying there's got to be some sorcery here.
I find most of your ideas, I shouldn't say this, but most of your ideas pretty much irresistible. I'm a devoted reader and a defender of your work, but my paranoid self every once in a while, tells me that I might be wrong. and
And I might be wrong.
and everybody's been wrong before,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
every thinker, every period of history has been, fell for the obviousness of its time.
Yeah.
And so it's a question I would have liked to ask Hegel, but I'm asking you. Do you sometimes think that you might be completely wrong?
I'm always happy to entertain critics, objectors like David Chalmers or others who challenge in a very fundamental way when I'm working on it. And then I see what their challenge amounts to. And if I sometimes have to scratch around pretty hard for a few weeks or months before I can see how to answer something, it only strengthens my conviction that I think I've got it right. And right or wrong, this has been the trajectory of my career. When I was in graduate school, materialism, physicalism with regard to the brain hit me like a ton of bricks. And I thought, oh, I see, learning is a sort of evolutionary process that goes on in the brain. At the time, I didn't know much about evolution, embarrassingly little about evolution. And I knew next to nothing about the brain, but the idea that consciousness and content could be explained in naturalistic terms struck me as the best bet in town. And so I went after it. And over the years, I never encountered a roadblock that I thought I hadn't overcome just fine. In fact, it seemed over the decades, I just kept turning the crank. And the results kept coming out. And I thought, well, this is looking better and better. And I think to this day, I think I got lucky. I think I had picked up the right end of the stick when I was in graduate school and have been just sort of carving away on it ever since. Seeing the world through my perspective on seeing the world, on consciousness, has been an enriching feature of my life because it's made me pay attention to a lot of things I wouldn't have paid attention to otherwise. And to be both puzzled and delighted by features of the world which might just have escaped me otherwise. I think that it has, if anything, heightened my sense of the importance of letting people know when you still can, that you love them, that you admire them, that they've made an influence on you, so that they know, because it's a nice thing to know, and you may not be able to, you may never see them again. And not believing in any afterlife, I can, I think, fairly comfortably resist ignoble urges that can come over one when one thinks about people that have done you wrong or misrepresented you or something. it's not as big a transgression as it might be if I had a more essentialist view of goodness and badness and responsibility. People make mistakes. People that are fundamentally good make mistakes.
Well, I hope you keep turning the crank for many more years to come then.
So do I.
Thank you very much for this interview.
Oh, well, thank you.